I'm currently in Tallinn, Estonia, where I'm visiting the beautiful Danish King's Garden. And you can really see a little bit of modernism right at the intersection of the days of old, where we see an old, pretty much city walls. And this is where we begin our discussion today.
Tumpea Castle, much like other castles, existed to show off wealth and power. Right? Not only are they a beacon of opulence, but they also serve the important purpose of fortification and protection, preventing outsiders from invading. This was a time where physical numbers and the strength of armies really determined history, but at the time deceptive strategies worked just as well for people to topple their enemies. In the 14th century, the Danish king unfairly increased taxes and ruled with an iron fist, creating great dissonance and uproar among the native Estonian population. And this is where rumors spread, saying things were only going to get worse under Danish rule. The native Estonians thought they had no other choice. They started an uprising, and that came at a really high cost, damaging their own native land and beautiful buildings. But the uprising was so successful that the Danish king called for a meeting with the four kings of Estonia to negotiate, especially because his army was busy fighting other wars at the time. And, according to the medieval code of honor, the four kings were granted safe passage to and from the Danish king's castle for the negotiation. But this ended up being a move of deception, placing the kings in a vulnerable position to kill them, effectively breaking the honorable code. What's the moral of the story? Rumors and deception can cause people to do things they may otherwise never do. But what does this have to do with anything? How can this story from the Middle Ages really inform us about anything related to misinformation? Well, the answer is really simple, actually. Misinformation can be a lot of things. And just like in the story, how there were rumors and deception, these are all forms of misinformation. The definition of misinformation is any piece of information that contains falsehoods. Now, this is slightly different from what we call disinformation, because disinformation is when there are falsehoods with the specific intent to deceive. And we see both of these a lot in our modern age. Now, what does it really mean when we say we don't trust something or that we have misinformation? Because just like there used to be a medieval code of honor, we now have expectations for ourselves and what we might find on the internet. We hope that when we search something up that we're going to get good answers. We hope that when we find information or read articles that they're telling the truth. But just as the medieval code of honor slowly went obsolete, we now also are becoming more vigilant and realizing that we can't trust everything we see on the internet, that we can't automatically believe that the articles or the sources that we're looking at are telling the truth. But despite this vigilance, misinformation still slips through the cracks. So where does it all start? What are we doing wrong? Just like any piece of information, misinformation also begins at a source. So think a TV story, news article, social media. But even if you hear something from a friend in passing, that is also a source of information and potentially misinformation. So it just takes one individual and it just takes one place for all of this to begin. Now, the issue with misinformation is that it spreads very quickly. So think about your classic childhood game of telephone. In that classic childhood game, what happens is that one person starts with a word or a phrase, and then they say it to the next person, and then they say it to the next, and so on and so forth. And throughout that entire process, if you've ever played the game telephone before, you know for a fact that the last person who is supposed to repeat the phrase or word back, they say something completely different. The entire phrase has lost its meaning. It's lost in translation. And misinformation is actually largely quite the same. So let's say, for example, we have someone who claims that a bacterial infection is the exact same thing as getting a toxin or a poison. And you tell them, yeah, no, that's absolutely ridiculous. I'm pretty sure you're wrong. That's great, because in that situation, you've snuffed out the misinformation. You've made sure that it doesn't spread beyond that point, right? But the truth of the matter is, not everyone is going to be able to do that. And just like this game of telephone, When one person tells someone something, let's say they tell three people, and then those three people tell three other people, and then those three people tell five people. Maybe they're a little bit more popular or a little bit more excited to tell this particular piece of news. It's only a matter of time until thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of people now know this piece of information, right? Now let's be honest here. That little science fact about bacteria and poison, it's not the most riveting or exciting thing in the world. It's probably not going to get the attention of millions of people. But let's think about some other stuff. Maybe gossip about celebrities. Maybe personal information about your health and how you can improve it. Maybe news stories that are affecting you directly. And maybe even scandals or something along those lines. All of these things are a little bit more juicy, a lot more interesting, and that means that more people are willing to spread it like wildfire. Why? Because it gets attention, right? And because you think it's riveting, shocking news. And these are the cases where misinformation is the most dangerous, because it spreads, and just like the game of telephone, it could lose its meaning or be lost in translation. And as a result, now tons and tons of people believe in something. And when more and more people believe in something, the harder it is to correct, the harder it is to combat that misinformation. And now you're left in a situation where now most people believe in something that's false. And if you are the voice of reason, if you are the one who've done your research, how do you combat that? How do you go against that? Let's talk about an example. In 2017, there was a film called A Dog's Purpose. And leading up to the release of this film, there was actually a leaked behind-the-scenes video that supposedly showed animal cruelty during the filming of the movie, and that had scenes with real dogs. And the clip showed a dog that was really hesitant and scared to go into some turbulent water. And there was a bunch of clips that were stitched together to kind of just show how distressed the dog was. And many organizations like PETA and just everyday internet users used this as an opportunity to call for the movie to be boycotted or canceled. But in reality, this was actually a deliberate move by a news outlet that is known for sensationalizing and exaggerating headlines to gather more views. In fact, they did an investigation on these clips, and it found that the clips were actually combined from different days of filming and was intentionally gathered to look misleading. And the other thing they found was they intentionally created and kept the video and released it later, closer to the release date of the movie, just so it could stir up some buzz. And that investigation was done by American Humane, and they confirmed that there was no mistreatment of animals, that the dog selected for the film was specifically chosen for their love of water and swimming. But at this point, the truth didn't matter to most people. Most people, all they saw was a cute dog in distress, and they pressed that share button. They told their friends about the new movie coming out that weekend that mistreated animals during filming. And at a certain point, it was actually widely accepted as fact that this movie had violated some kind of animal rights. The entire internet was in an uproar. And that is how misinformation spreads. One person shares to three, and those three share to three more, until you have millions of people believing something. But unfortunately, this misinformation pipeline goes much deeper than mistakes or edited videos. Let's think about journalism. When I say journalism, you may think of sources like CBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. But there's also a huge phenomenon called internet journalism. You have BuzzFeed, TMZ, Mashable. And these are sources that don't pride themselves in academic rigor. They know what they're doing. Rather, they pride themselves on staying on top of trends and stories so that you can get juicy information quicker than anyone else. Reputable journalism, on the other hand, requires source checking, peer edits, and long editing processes, which means you cannot stay on top of all the trends as quickly. So as a result, misinformation isn't just spread person to person, it is also spread among internet media companies. And this is what we call speculative journalism. So what is that, speculative journalism? This is where stories are shared before all the facts are collected, or intentionally presenting a possibility as an actuality. Because the faster you get your media out there, the more clicks you'll get very quickly. So you cannot gather all the facts, you need to be the first one to publish. So for example, without collecting all the information about the filming process in that movie, A Dog's Purpose, they reported it as objective truth that they were abusing animals. right? It's the internet. No one is stopping them from reporting on these things. And you also cannot forget the way that these are reported. They have a lot of clickbait titles that tell you, you won't believe what happened, or, top 10 things that happened, you'll never guess what number 6 is, something along those lines, right? These are all crafted in a way to try and force you, or at least pique your interest to click on to these stories. But then it goes even deeper. From the speculative journalism, you also get what's called circular reporting. And that's when other internet media companies make the same report on their website using the original reporter as their credible source. So here's what that looks like. Let's say we have a BuzzFeed story that cites TMZ, and then Mashable cites BuzzFeed, and so on and so forth. But the original TMZ story wasn't necessarily factual. So now we have BuzzFeed going off of rushed journalism. Then we have Mashable citing off of the citation of rushed journalism. And basically, it creates this echo chamber where these internet media companies are just saying the same thing, and none of them have checked their facts. And the reason this happens is because no one wants to be left out of the trend. These internet media companies are no different in that incentive. And there's lots of reasons why you might want to do this, right? Because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day if the story is actually accurate, as long as people click on the story, you get more traffic, and you get advertising revenue, right? But also sometimes it can be part of a greater agenda. For example, PETA needing more fuel to maintain their relevance by spreading an unverified story. So where do we go from here? What can we do about misinformation? It's hard because I could tell you, just check your sources, right? And as if you haven't heard that one already. But the reality of the situation is very simple. You do have to check your sources, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. It's not just, let me do a quick Google search, because it's possible with circular reporting that the first 5 stories are the exact same kind of social media journalism platform, or I guess there wouldn't be the exact same, but similar social media journalism platforms just reporting off of each other, right? So the first tip I have for you actually is to make sure that you find contrasting reports that say opposite things. Now, it might be that one report is just saying something to be contrarian, just to say something else. But it's important to find those kinds of things. Get 2 sides of the story, the opposite opinions of a story, something along those lines, and from there, figure out which source or which version of the story has more reputable sources. This can help you kind of figure out which side of the story appears to be more true. The second, you can cut off the branch. It is important that you do not contribute to misinformation and spread it as well. And even if you're not an avid social media user who shares everything they see and all that, this includes even conversation, right? A lot of people are guilty of this. It is that you hear something on the news, you hear something in passing, and because it's interesting, you just say it in a casual conversation with a friend or a coworker or a classmate. But at the end of the day, that ends up contributing to misinformation if you did not check to see if what you were saying was actually true or not. So make sure that before you just say something to start an interesting and exciting conversation, that you're also not actually contributing to misinformation. And the last one, be diligent in follow-up. The most interesting thing about misinformation is that obviously the exciting story is always going to be what circulates the most. But the correction that comes after the story that had misinformation is never popular. Who wants to hear the boring correction journalism follow-up that said, apologies for being wrong on this particular story, right? Just like in that movie, A Dog's Purpose, they had that viral clip that absolutely spread everywhere. But the report done by American Humane, which was the follow-up, which did see that there were no evidences of animal rights abuses, that did not spread whatsoever. It was just not as interesting of a story. So make sure that you yourself are diligent, because you are not going to come across those kinds of follow-up stories unless you look for them, because those are not ones that are spread throughout social media or through conversation. If you're able to do those things, I promise you, you'll be better equipped and a lot more ready to handle all the misinformation that comes your way. Whether we like it or not, we live in what people might call the fake news era. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of people who will simply disagree with you and call whatever you have to say fake news as opposed to genuinely engaging with you. And the reason why this happens is just because of how easy it is for anyone to say anything, right? And that allows people to communicate however they want, spread stories however they want, and spread misinformation as well. It is our job to remain vigilant and be loyal to what we believe is the right thing to do, which is hopefully spread the truth. And in such a time, it could be very, very hard to communicate and challenge others who might disagree with you or blatantly might be spreading misinformation. But it's our responsibility to keep going. It's really, really interesting because just like in the Middle Ages, lies, deception, all of these existed. Misinformation existed in the Middle Ages and probably, if I'm honest with you, ever since humans could start communicating. But at the end of the day, what's unbelievably remarkable of what we have now is that we have the tools and everything that we need to dispel misinformation just as easily as we can create it. So it's just about us and our responsibility to use those tools for something that can help individuals and dispel misinformation. Thanks for watching.